On the Edge of History presents Burning Ambition. In his lifetime, he faced fires that could burn down a whole city block, but his legacy was forged in one fire that he couldn't put out. Growing up in Nova Scotia, Canada, at the turn of the 20th century, he lived hand in hand with the harbor lifestyle. He walked the narrow streets and watched the ships come and go. As the city became more populous, more buildings had to accommodate the people, which called for more than just a volunteer fire brigade. In fact, the country's first professional fire station opened in his hometown after the city incorporated in 1841. As a young man, he became a firefighter and he lived through many dangerous calls that came in from the harbor. With wooden buildings all along the shore and flammable chemicals coming in and out of the harbor, fires were commonplace. In fact, the sound of the clanging bell on the fire wagon became background noise for people living near the harbor. Joining the oldest fire operation in the country, he worked his way up, eventually becoming the driver of the newly purchased American LaFrance pumper, the first modernized firefighting equipment in Canada. He was proud to be behind the wheel of the Patricia, a blazing spectacle of painted steel and gleaming chrome, driving the crew, the 9 men who called themselves the Patsies. But despite all the training and preparation, no matter how much experience he gathered in his 16 years as a firefighter, nothing could have prepared Billy Wells for what happened on a chilly December morning in 1917. When the alarm sounded at 8:30 a.m. at the West Street station, the men rushed into the Patricia, preparing to douse another of the multiple small fires that dotted the harbor front on a daily basis. Maybe this time it would prove to be another false alarm, which were almost as common, as panicked shipyard workers put out small fires with water all by themselves. This day, however, would be different. When they reached the harbor, they could see a large freighter ship on fire with flames reaching 500 feet into the air and thick black smoke rising up into the gray December sky. The heat from the fire was so intense, the firefighters couldn't even look at it. What they didn't know was that this freighter was a French cargo ship carrying munitions, 2,300 tons of wet and dry pyrrhic acid, 200 tons of TNT, 10 tons of gun cotton, and 35 tons of benzol, a highly explosive mixture. After a collision with the Iwo, a Belgian relief ship, a spark had ignited the flammable benzol that spilled across the deck of the Mont Blanc. The crew had abandoned ship, and the Mont Blanc drifted aimlessly for 20 minutes. And the problem facing the Patricia and the thousands of rubberneckers along the shoreline is that no one knew about the explosives. Remember, this was wartime, and ships often disguised their cargo on their manifests. To make matters worse, when the French crew jumped into their lifeboats, they headed for Dartmouth, miles across the harbor, away from the ship, away from the Halifax harbor. So, thousands of people on the shore, including Billy Wells and the crew of the Patricia, had no idea of the potential danger that awaited them. On board the ship, unseen from shore, the flames reached the volatile cargo at 9:04 a.m. With a blinding flash and a deafening roar, the tons of stored explosives detonated. The thunderclap that accompanied the explosion echoed up and down the length of the harbor channel. It boomed across the cities of Halifax and neighboring Dartmouth, and it was audible hundreds of miles away. The air temperature flared to 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit, about 5,000 degrees Celsius, which is almost as hot as the surface of the sun, and was hot enough to vaporize the Mont Blanc. The heat of the explosion superheated the water around the ship and under the ship, gasifying the sea to the harbor floor, 20 feet below. After water rushed in to fill the vacuum, it threw up a tsunami. The massive wall of water, 30 feet high, raced across the harbor to Dartmouth. The tsunami battered ships, swamped boats, and tossed vessels of all sizes up onto the shore. It dragged people to their deaths when it washed over piers and sped waist-deep along streets on both sides of the harbor. At the moment of the blast, the crew of the Patricia were still positioning their fire hoses, while driver Billy Wells was maneuvering the pumper truck to position it close to a fire hydrant. The searing fireball that blew outward from the blast epicenter incinerated everything and everyone in its vicinity. 1 minute, Billy Wells had been sitting in the driver's seat of the Patricia, his hands on the steering wheel. And the next thing he knew, he was standing 50 yards from where Pier 6 had been, and he was almost naked. The blast had torn off his clothing along with most of the flesh on his right arm. Although he felt no pain, the bones were exposed and his left hand was still clutched to half of the Patricia's steering wheel. It blew all the toes off me. But I wasn't so badly hurt, only it took a hunk out of my arm. That's all, Wells recalled in an interview with the CBC. I guess there wasn't room in hell for me. When he looked around for the fire truck and his mates, Billy saw nothing. They were all gone. But he had no time to make sense of any of this because in the next instant, the tsunami swept over him and carried him off. When the wave brought him back down Richmond Hill, he got tangled up in the telegraph wires. All he had left on was his pants and one boot. It was a miracle that the wave did not claim Billy Wells' life. It was just not his turn to die. When he regained consciousness, he staggered westward through the ruins of the rail yard and into what had been the Richmond Hill neighborhood. The damage and the carnage he saw all around him were nightmarish and horrifying. I made my way to Campbell Road, he said. The sight was awful, with people hanging out of windows dead, some bodies spread over the overhead telegraph wires. After helping a couple of young children crying in the street, he finally collapsed. He was taken to a hospital where he lay in a hallway for 2 days bleeding until he could be treated. In the Camp Hill Hospital, his life was probably saved by a new antiseptic, Dakin solution, which had been perfected during the war overseas. His healthcare providers cleaned his wounds with it, hastening the separation of dead from living tissue. He lived through the worst man-made explosion in history up until that time, the Halifax explosion of 1917. Almost 2,000 people in Halifax and surrounding areas lost their lives, with hundreds of them perishing in a heartbeat of the explosion. Billy Wells survived Canada's worst disaster. He was permanently scarred, but he lived a long, good life. In fact, in retirement, he went on to become a crossing guard at Russell and Gottingen streets, not far from where his whole crew lost their lives. He may have lived through one of the largest explosions in history, but nothing could extinguish his burning passion for serving the public. He lived an ordinary life before history gave him a supporting role in an extraordinary event.